Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are diving straight into how the absence of stimuli, the void, is weaponized in art to scare the living daylights out of us, and how it literally alters the physical structure of our brains in reality. It doesn't matter if you're watching a horror movie in a pitch-black theater or hurtling through the silent vacuum of space. Nothingness is an incredibly powerful force. But before we give away the whole roadmap, let's just start right here with the core mystery. Why does the human brain fundamentally reject silence and emptiness? Well, let's jump right in and see exactly how creators manipulate our brain's inherent fear of nothingness and what actually happens when that nothingness becomes our physical reality.
Section 1. Engineering Fear Through Sound. If we look at some amazing insights from a Storyblocks tutorial on horror sound design, we can see exactly how a classic jump scare is engineered in the studio. Sound designers realize that true fear isn't just about cranking up the volume. It's all about the careful orchestration of what's missing. You start with step 1, layering in those ambient creaks, wind, or whispers to set a super creepy scene. Then you hit step 2, the riser. That's that screeching string or reverse reverb effect that builds tension and puts your nervous system on high alert. But here is the absolutely crucial element. Step 3, those few seconds of dead silence. This void is specifically designed to lull you into a false sense of security right before step 4, the loud, hard-hitting stinger of the jump scare itself. The silence is literally what makes the scare work. Moving on to section 2, writing the unspeakable dread. Now, this manipulation of absence isn't just limited to audio. It's actually the secret to writing a truly terrifying screenplay, which is something professional writers over in the r/screenwriting Reddit community talk about all the time. Think about a standard functional script compared to a highly evocative one. One version might just tell you that a character walks into a shed and finds something gross. It gets the point across, sure, but it's totally flat. But a brilliant script intentionally forces the reader and ultimately the audience to sit in that eerie, quiet stillness for just a moment. You feel a massive sigh of relief at seeing, just mice, right before the horrifying reveal of what those mice are actually chewing on. It's all about the pacing. As one writer perfectly summarized in that same forum, true terror requires the audience to deeply empathize with the isolation and dread of the situation. It's definitely not just about throwing around buckets of blood. It's about making us feel like we could be trapped in that unknowable, unfamiliar void right alongside the character, tapping into our absolute deepest inner fears. Which brings us to section 3, the vacant gaze. So we know how creators build the void for us through sound and pacing. But how do they describe a character whose mind has already succumbed to that emptiness? There was a completely fascinating thread on the r/Writing Hub subreddit where folks brainstormed brilliant alternatives to that overused phrase, stared blankly. These descriptors, like having a vacant gaze or eyes as void gates, perfectly capture the sheer horror of a character's psychological detachment. It's that terrifying realization that the sentience, the cognitive ability, the mind, simply isn't there anymore. One user put it incredibly well, describing a void behind them, a nothingness that even the vacuum of deep space couldn't match. Wow. And that chilling artistic description actually serves as the perfect bridge to our next topic, because what does the void actually do to human biology in real life? Let's get into section 4, the biology of deprivation. When the void stops being just a creative writing tool and becomes a literal physical environment, the results are shocking. There's a dense, comprehensive review recently published in Brain Sciences that details exactly how the human brain adapts and ultimately breaks down when it's deprived of external stimuli. The researchers define sensory deprivation as a reduction or total absence of external sensory input. And hey, we aren't just talking about sitting in a soundproof room for an afternoon. This condition spans everything from isolated intensive care units and involuntary solitary confinement all the way to deep space missions, cave explorations, and long-term Antarctic expeditions. The physical toll of this kind of isolation is profound. Prolonged nothingness literally alters our biology. Without stimuli, our dopamine pathways, the ones that control reward and motivation, get completely altered, leading directly to severe demotivation and depression. Meanwhile, our body's stress control center, the HPA axis, basically goes into hyperactivation. It dysregulates our cortisol rhythms and causes intense chronic anxiety. And honestly, the most shocking part? Neuroimaging studies of people in extreme isolation show a literal reduction in gray matter volume. the void actually shrinks the hippocampus, which heavily impairs memory, learning, and even spatial orientation. That takes us right to section 5, when the void stares back. Faced with all this biological deterioration and a total lack of sensory input to process, your brain doesn't just quietly power down. Nope, it does something incredibly desperate to survive. Because the brain simply cannot accept silence, it actively begins to invent its own reality to fill the void. This taps into a function called apophenia, which is basically our brain's fundamental need to find patterns and provide explanations, even when there is absolutely nothing there to explain. This stems from something called deafferentation theory. Essentially, when sensory input is completely cut off, these suddenly orphaned areas of your brain become hypersensitive and highly excitable, and this results in some truly terrifying phenomena. People with visual impairments might experience phantom vision, while those in extreme isolation can suffer from the prisoner's cinema. These are incredibly vivid, fearful hallucinations experienced by people in solitary confinement. Your brain will literally generate voices, music, or terrifying visual imagery simply because the alternative, absolute nothingness, is totally unbearable to it. It can even lead to derealization, which is a profound sense of detachment from the physical world. Now, the crucial factor in all of this is context and duration. A voluntary 30-minute dip into a float tank, that can be wonderfully therapeutic. It promotes deep relaxation and reduces stress. But involuntary, prolonged isolation is a completely different story. It is so biologically and psychologically destructive that under international human rights law, it is actually classified as psychological torture. The brain literally begins to collapse in on itself. To wrap up this explainer, I really want you to consider this provocative reality. We've seen how sound designers use just a few seconds of silence to terrify us, and how our brains literally shrink and hallucinate when deprived of input for months. So, if our brains are this terrified of the void, what happens when we go to Mars? As space agencies prepare for long-duration deep space missions lasting years in the monotonous, confined, sensory-deprived vacuum of space, surviving the absolute nothingness of the void might just be the greatest biological hurdle humanity will ever face. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you in the next explainer.